Good morning, everyone. Welcome to this webinar and workshop on anonymizing qualitative and quantitative data. My name is Maureen Haker, and I have worked with the UK Data Service for 8 years on everything from digitizing data to reuse projects. I also teach research methods at University of Suffolk in the faculty for social sciences and humanities. And I am here with Anka, who has worked with the UK Data Service as their Research Data Services Officer for, we won't say how many years, Anka. I think it's actually less than me, so at least you've got that.
6, yeah.
All right. Can you move on and I'll introduce what we're doing today. If this is your first webinar with us, rest assured that you're all muted. We can't see you. If you do have a question you'd like to ask, again, please feel free to type it into the Q&A box in your menu. We're aiming to talk for around 45 minutes or so, which should leave us some time at the end for a couple of short exercises on anonymizing and some time for question and answers. Please be aware that, what you type into that question box as you go along can be seen by everyone unless you direct it specifically to us as the organizers. Okay. So what we're planning to do today is to give you a bit of background on anonymization, why it's important, what some of that theoretical underpinning of it is, what are your legal responsibilities as a researcher. We'll then go into a short exercise with Mentimeter. We'll give a more practical overview on how to anonymize and what are some tips for qualitative and quantitative data specifically. And then we'll end with some exercises, further resources, and any questions that you might have. And now I think we're over to Anka, who's got some Menti questions for you.
Yes, so we just have some, hello everyone, sorry, I haven't said hello yet. So we just have some introductory questions for you. So if you go to menti.com, so you can do this from if you open a separate tab in your browser, or if you have a tablet or a phone, you can do that from another device as well. And you introduce that code, you should be able to not log in, but access the presentation and the exercises. Okay, so I see some people have joined already. Okay, I'll just wait a bit longer.
I've just tried to log in as well, and I am able to log in. So if you're getting something that says you're not able to access, do try again.
Okay, so, we have about 24, 25. Okay, so we have about half. So we have 46 out of 108, so 108 participants. So again, just go to www.menti.com and then introduce that code that you have on the screen, and you should be able to join. Let's see, is there anything on the, we'll give it maybe 10 more seconds, and then because I see the count is stopped now, so
yeah, we've got a few
maybe not everyone
still coming in.
Yeah,
but they can join as well. If you're still trying to access, you can join in as we go along as well. It'll just bring you to the question we're on.
Okay, so we have 76 or ish, unless people have clicked both the like and the heart button. If not, we have 63. Okay, should we start then? Right, so this is just, as I said, there are a few introductory questions just for us to have an idea about why you're here and what you're interested in finding out in today's webinar. So if we have the first question, and we just wanted to know what type of data are you looking to anonymize. So we have a few options. We have quantitative, qualitative, perhaps you're interested in both, perhaps you're not sure yet. we're just interested in seeing that breakdown. Okay, so I think most of us are interested in both, and qualitative. Although qualitative is quite up there, high up there. Seems more than quantitative. Okay, I think everyone has voted, right? So we can see the trend. So okay, so we're interested in both, predominantly in qualitative. We only have three people that are not sure yet. Hopefully they can still find something out in today's. Okay, let's move on to the next question. So what information would you think about when talking about anonymizing data? So, you think about anonymization, what kind of information does it come into your mind that, that shouldn't stay in the data, right? And you can submit, right, so we have them popping on the screen now. So we have personal data, names, okay, name, names are coming up a lot. Date of birth, yeah, indeed. So the full date of birth can be problematic as well. We have personal identifiers, yes, very good. Locations, anything that can identify a person, yes, very good. I think pretty much everyone has submitted well, not everyone submitted an answer, but I see that we haven't really have any more submissions. Okay, so we have job title, NHS number, yeah, very good. That can lead us to an individual, any identifying information, any direct identifiers or combinations of characteristics that identify someone. Yes, that is very good. Unusual characteristics, yes. Telephone numbers, email addresses, yes, and that will lead us to an individual as well. Name and address, surname, date of birth, medical data, yes, very good. Personal information. Okay, so I think we all have a pretty good idea of what we're thinking of: postcode, job role, affiliation, career. Yeah, all very good. Okay, so we're just going to go back to the presentation now, and we're going to come back to this exercise at a later point once we've gone through all the slides. Okay, so I'm going to leave the Mentimeter on for now, but nothing is going to happen because we're going to move on with the presentation. So if you turn your attention back to the screen, we're going to back to the presentation, sorry. I'm going to share now the... Okay, hopefully you can see my screen, and we're just going to move on with the presentation.
Yeah, I can see the screen again. Perfect. Thank you,
Oh,
Anka.
sorry.
So I just want to give you a bit of background on anonymization theory. It's just this one slide on it, but I think it's quite important because it helps you conceptualize what it is that we want to achieve basically with anonymization. Mark Elliott has established the UK Anonymization Network, and that's published the Anonymization decision-making framework, which is really, really useful and kind of lays this out in much more detail. The National Center for Research Methods has posted extensive tutorials on this, so this is really just to give you a quick overview. And basically, this framework outlines 3 key aspects to decisions on how to anonymize. And the first of these is a data situation audit, which is basically, it specifically considers where do you want to present the data, what's your role and your responsibility with that data, and what are the specifics of the data. So what variables have been collected and where are they stored. The next stage is to actually do a risk analysis. What are the actual chances that there will be a disclosure? And what I mean by disclosure is that you can link some kind of variable to an actual person, right? So you can make that link between some information about someone and who that person is. And the final stage is impact management. So if there is a disclosure, what are your plans for what happens then? Just a couple key points to make here. This framework comprehensively points out that analyzing the risk of disclosure should be iterative. So it's not linear. There's no single point where this can be assessed, but rather you should think about all the places that data are stored and or presented. The risk for example, publishing data extracts in a publication should be considered alongside sharing data with colleagues across institutions or storing data on your computer. Other point that I want to reiterate is that Mark Elliott stresses that it's not possible to, quote unquote, fully anonymize data. Fully anonymizing would mean that even a participant who is looking themselves at the data set would not be able to identify their own answers. That is what full anonymization might mean. So stripping the data down to that point reduces the value of the data for analysis. So to avoid depleting that value of the data, even comprehensive anonymization would still have to leave at least some room, albeit it might be a theoretical kind of space for re-identification. The idea is to balance the risk of disclosure. So what is the probability of re-identifying to a point where disclosure can be mitigated and dealt with. So fully anonymizing or guaranteeing confidentiality is just not possible and actually probably not even desirable, as it suggests that it's stripping the data down to something that's rather worthless. Anka, I think over to you now.
Thank you, Maureen. Okay, so now because so this is an introductory webinar, so we're not assuming any prior knowledge on the topic from our participants. So we wanted to, go back a few steps and discuss what is disclosure, why do we need anonymization? So when we think about disclosure, we think, it's identification, it's being able to re-identify someone from a particular data set or from a few data sets or by linking a few data sets. So it happens when we're able to identify a data subject, and and there are different types of disclosure. So we have primary and secondary disclosure. I will only explain briefly what these mean. However, if you're interested in knowing more about this, there's a few resources that we can point you to. Primary disclosure is being able to identify someone from a data source, so from a data set. You're able to look at that, and there's enough information in there that you can point to, you can identify someone. And in that case, the general advice is wherever you access that data from, you need to, the best practice guidance is to stop working with that data and inform the data owner, because they might not be aware of that, and they need to obviously take some action in that sense. That is primary disclosure. And then secondary disclosure is as well being able to identify someone, but not necessarily from one data source. That would be linking multiple sources or of data to be able to identify someone. Okay, as I said, if you'd like to know more about this, there's plenty of resources out there, and we can point you to some reading if that's what you'd like to know more about. Okay, so then moving on to anonymization. So that is a process that, of course, attempts to prevent or reduce that disclosure risk or identification of data subjects from a specific data set or data sets. We're going to discuss today both anonymization and pseudonymization and the difference between them. And both of these processes are part of what is called statistical disclosure control, or SDC. So then the aim of statistical disclosure control is to minimize or mitigate that risk of disclosure, of identification, to an acceptable level that still allows researchers to maximize data use. So as Maureen already mentioned, ideally we wouldn't want to strip the data of all that valuable information that can be used for future research. So to use the data to its full potential. And so we, at the bottom here, we have some errors that indicate that relationship between, so the more we try to reduce that disclosure risk, so more that we are stripping the data out of that valuable information, the more we have, that information loss, because that potential for reuse is reduced. Okay. And now looking at the difference between anonymization and pseudonymization. So what is anonymized data? It's data that contains information which does not relate to an individual or an identifiable natural person, or to personal data that has been rendered anonymous in such a manner that the data subject is not or no longer identifiable. So we are not able to re-identify data subjects, even the data owner. Pseudonymized data, on the other hand, is the process of redacting that data or data set in such a manner that the personal data can no longer be attributed to a specific data subject without the use of additional information. So another data set or just external information, provided that such additional information is kept separately and is subject to technical and organizational measures to ensure that personal data are not attributed to an identified or identifiable natural person. So in this case, identifiable data has been removed or has been redacted. So that key is kept separate, is kept by the data owner, and what is made available is a version of the data that has been rendered as pseudonymized. So all that information has been taken out. So a bit more information about this. So according to the ICO, re-identification describes the process of turning anonymized data back into personal data through the use of data matching or similar techniques. And the Data Protection Act does not prohibit the disclosure of personal data, but any disclosure has to be fair, lawful, and in compliance with data protection principles. Again, we're not going to go into this because it's beyond the scope of our webinar, but if you are interested in reading more about that, please have a look at the guidance from ICO and, of course, the Data Protection Act. So what we need to consider when we think about the difference between anonymization and pseudonymization and the data that results. So we need to consider the age of the information. So we need to think, of course, data becomes less sensitive over time, but however, of course, it's not just, we need to consider the ethical implications of that data. So, for example, if we have data that about people that are deceased, of course, that becomes less sensitive. However, we still need to think whether there are any ethical restrictions there. For example, would using that data have any implications to the relatives of the deceased, etc. We need to think about the level of detail in the data, of course, the context. So is it about private life of these individuals, or is it about more public matters? Is it about their working life or life satisfaction? And the rule of thumb. So we need to try to assess the effect, as Maureen mentioned again before, so impact management, if any. So what disclosure would mean for any individual concerned and included in that data set. Okay. Okay, so now in terms of classifying information, so when we think about the different types of information and variables, so here we introduce the notion of variables, and as we've seen from the exercise, the questions that you've already answered, you already know about this, quite a few of you do. So we're going to go through them, of course. So we have direct identifiers and indirect identifiers. And what we mean by that is direct identifiers are information that directly identifies a data subject. So an example there would be a name, an address. So very correctly, everything that has been mentioned in the exercise and you've submitted. So we have national insurance numbers, IP addresses, social insurance number, NHS number was mentioned in the responses from you as well. So everything that can point directly to a data subject. On the other hand, we have our indirect identifiers, and this is information that in combination may uniquely identify a data subject. It can potentially be linked to other sources of data, for example, the electoral register, and examples here we have so we have gender, we have age, region, occupation, income, etc. But this indirect identifier, so it's pretty much everything that we can think of that doesn't link directly to someone, right? So everything that is not direct identifier can probably be classified as an indirect identifier. And then we have sensitive variables. So this is information that is often subject to legal and ethical concerns. And here, as an example, we have criminal history, sexual preference and behavior, political affiliation, medical records, income. So this can lead to that secondary disclosure that we discussed earlier, even if identity disclosure is prevented. So even if primary disclosure is not possible, we can have secondary disclosure if we have these sensitive variables in. And the one observation that some variables can be both identifying and sensitive, and an example here would be income, and we included here a link to some more reading for you if you're interested. It's called You're Not So Anonymized, and it's a really interesting piece to read in terms of how we think that data is not necessarily, it's anonymized. However, sometimes it's not really, and there have been quite a few exercises by some scientists and some other people just interested in proving that data that is out there is not as anonymized as it meant to be. So we'll leave you to read that in your own time if you're interested. Okay, so a bit more about that relationship between anonymization and pseudonymization, and here we have just a visual representation of different types of data. So we have raw identifiable data. So that is data that has just been collected, contains all the information, including personal information. Then further down that spectrum to the right, we have pseudonymized, which we've already discussed what that is, and then we have anonymized at the other end of that arrow. Below we have data utility, we have access controls and information loss. So if we think back of that relationship in the previous slide between data utility and information loss, so what can the potential for reuse of that data, so that's what data utility here stands for, is it's an inverse relationship, right, between that and information loss. So the more we strip the data down of that valuable information, the more the data utility is reduced, and of course that information loss is there. And then we have access controls as well. So the reason why we put that here is because we also discuss access controls today, and how that is part of not the solution, but is part of a how do you say, an environment to make sure that we can share some of the data that is, again, not stripped down of all that valuable information, right? So when we have data that where data utility is quite high, so we still maintain some of those indirect identifiers in to allow future reuse, then we can place that under access controls. So we sort of control in that way that we mitigate that disclosure risk by managing that access. Okay, so I hope this is quite clear. I thought it would be an interesting way to present what we're discussing in one point with some arrows. I hope that it all makes sense to you as well. Okay, and then, oh, I'm sorry.
That's all right.
There we
Just go back. Perfect. Thank you, Anka. So, following on from that point that Anka is making sort of about, how you strip down some of that data and the extent to which you do so, it's probably also worth mentioning that researchers still fall under some legal obligations to disclose. So in the UK, researchers have a duty of confidentiality. However, that duty of confidentiality is not absolute, and it is not protected by legal privilege. Specifically, researchers are still obliged to inform appropriate authorities where there is, for example, abuse of children or vulnerable adults, or crimes that are covered under terrorism prevention legislation, and that includes things like money laundering. So in my own experience, for my PhD research, I went through the Health Research Authority for ethical approval, and specifically they scrutinized the consent forms for clear statements, which clarified the limits of confidentiality. And that included thinking about possibilities of where raw data would be presented, such as publications, but also informing participants that I could actually break confidentiality, based on what they told me. So including all of that information meant that my information sheets, my consent forms had to be quite comprehensive in terms of what I had to actually discuss with participants. And you can see a sample of that text here on the slide. So I think the point is that anonymization is a bit of an art, and it's not absolute. And that's one of the points that I hope you take away from this. Okay, so now hopefully you are recognizing that anonymization is certainly one strategy for protecting participants, but it may not be the only one. And I know we've had a couple questions come through already, and one of them I would like to, when we get to the Q&A towards the end, I would like to discuss verbally a bit more, because I think the answer is a bit comprehensive. But, I think, thinking about actually anonymization is just one strategy for that participant protection is really important. So when you're at the end of your project and you might be sharing your data, either because it's a requirement of the grant that you've received, or perhaps that you are working across different institutions and you have to share data, or it's something that you've just chosen to do because you want to maximize the value of your data. It's important to think about who has access to the data and when. So at the UK Data Service, there are 3 access options which can limit who, where, and when the data can be accessed. So you can have, for example, open data, where anybody can download the data direct from our website. Usually, most collections ask for explicit permission from participants to be able to file it under open data. We do have a few historical collections that we are able to offer as open because the data isn't considered to be particularly sensitive, and all of the participants are most likely deceased. But generally, we ask for explicit permission from participants to be able to file it under an open access license. Most of our data, however, is held under a safeguarded license. And this means that anyone who wishes to use the data has to register with us, has to sign our end user license, and has to tell us what they're using the data for. So the end user license stipulates that users cannot share the data onward. They have to, in a sense, protect it. And in the unlikely event that a participant's identity is uncovered, that end user license also stipulates that they won't share the participant identities. There's other terms and conditions, it's a long legal statement as such, but those are 2 really important points that hold users legally responsible for the protection of participants as if they were, primary researchers. And finally, for sensitive data, where there is a high risk to participants, we also have what's called controlled data. And controlled data restricts access. You need to undergo special training to access it, and it can only be accessed from our servers. So we won't just transfer the data over to you. You actually have to come to us in order to access it. These options represent access to data that's been shared, but you can certainly apply these ideas to any point in your project and always be thinking about who is allowed to access the data, when and where can it be accessed. And if you can go to the next slide. There's a lot more information about data management in our Managing and Sharing Research Data book, which is on its 2nd edition. There's also lots of case studies and examples to help talk through some of those principles that we've covered so far. Next. Now thinking about specific types of data. So I'm going to cover qualitative data and then hand over to Anka to cover quantitative data. And just to say that while the principles of anonymization are going to be similar across the different types of data, we also recognize that certain types of data have some special aspects to them that are actually really important in terms of coming up with a concrete, practical plan of how you're going to anonymize. So thinking about anonymizing qualitative data, I'm going to start with just a few tips. So usually we say to anonymize qualitative data at the point of transcription. And that way you have lots of opportunities when you're editing your transcripts and when you're analyzing them to check the anonymization as well. And then on top of that, you would then only have audio files, presumably, or perhaps if you've taken images of diaries or essays or something like that, you'd only have one set of files that are unanonymized. There is an exception to this rule, though, and that's longitudinal studies. So where linkages are needed between data types or across time, it might be better to wait and anonymize at a later point to avoid losing some of those linkages or avoid compromising some of those linkages. Coming up with a clear anonymization plan is going to help ensure consistency across the project. And this would outline what you want to do with direct identifiers and indirect identifiers, certain types of data that you want to watch out for. You should also identify where something has been replaced. So this is often done using square brackets. So when I've digitized interview transcripts, that tends to be what we use. And a lot of transcripts that we have coming in use a similar kind of annotation. But there is no kind of standardized way of annotating that. So as long as you know what the annotation you're using is and it's clearly documented, then anything can work. If you're not annotating, so if you're not using those square brackets to indicate changes, then keeping a log of the changes could be done instead. Above all, try to avoid just blanking out. You lose a lot of context when you do that. So you can't identify where the same name has come up again. You wouldn't be able to identify relationships that people have between each other within your data sets. All of that lovely context, basically, that makes qualitative data so powerful and so useful. You don't just want to black that out. So instead, try using pseudonyms. And finally, avoid over-anonymizing. So I've found that it's quite common if you are new to anonymization, it's quite common to over-anonymize at first. And then the more experience you get, the less you are likely to over-anonymize. So you should be utilizing, access options, getting consent where it's appropriate to help ensure protection of your participants. So anonymization should really be just one part of the plan. And certainly with qualitative data, you want to try and make that as light touch as possible to preserve that value of the qualitative data. So this slide shows just a really basic way of anonymizing an interview transcript. The obvious details are changed. So the name Lucas is given a pseudonym of Ken with no last name. The date of birth is aggregated to a wider category of just the year. The location is given a region rather than a specific town name. But the detail of what the interviewee has said is actually left alone. It's left untouched. And this is part of what makes anonymizing qualitative data quite particularly challenging, is because it shares so much detail and so much context that actually, the possibility of re-identifying someone can be still quite high. But at the same time, you don't want to lose that context when you're actually anonymizing it. Next. Okay, so I mentioned, and if you can just click through to show the other example as well. Thank you. I mentioned that you could use consent options alongside your anonymizing plan. So here's some wording that could be used in consent forms. So it tells participants where exact wording from them may be used, and that if you're planning on sharing it, where you're going to share it or with whom you're going to share it. So for example, that bottom one says, I'm asking for permission to use anonymized quotations and narrative themes. I'll anonymize any identifying details such as your name and address. It also notes who might have access to unanonymized versions of the data. And it does take time to explain this to participants, and it can be challenging to ensure that it's written in a way that's clear to participants what's going to happen to their data. However, going that extra step to ensure that they know what these things mean, how their data is going to be used, will ensure that they are informed, that they can ask questions, and it ensures that you are acting with the permission of your participants. Next. Once you have a clear anonymization plan and consent in place, again, don't forget about access. So different types of data can also have different access conditions. So for example, we have a collection at the UK Data Service on the foot and mouth disease that was collected in 2001 to 2003. So there were audio files, transcriptions of those audios, and diaries that were taken from participants. The majority of the collection was available under a safeguarded license. However, some of the more sensitive interviews were embargoed, which means that they were not available to be shared. They were not available for download until 15 years had passed after the end of the project. So with that time, that information became less sensitive. So they felt it was okay to then share it at a later point in time, which is fine. So you can embargo data as well. Audio files are still only available by permission from the researchers. So you can control, even at a file level, what is available to whom and when. So if you think the majority of the collection, it's okay to be shared, you can do that. And if there's an interview or two that you think, actually, this is quite sensitive, they talked about some things that were quite sensitive, you can restrict just those files as well. So conversely, we have examples like the Pioneers of Social Research, which is 43 life history interviews with prominent social researchers. Because these are prominent academics and they're quite widely known in their fields, it was sort of one of those decisions that was made early on that you can't fight this, so you might as well just go with it. So Thompson, the researcher, got permission during the consent process to make those interviews openly available. So that collection is actually freely available to download from anyone. And this was done with the permission of all participants. So he just ensured, and he actually got quite a granular consent in place. So he even got consent for some to use their real names and that sort of thing. So it's a good example of where actually you can make things openly available. Next. Finally, we have a collection it's called Managing Suffering at the End of Life, which is quite challenging data. So these are interviews that were done with families and practitioners for patients who were put on a palliative care plan of deep sedation until death. The plan was put in place to gather consent for the research initially, but then go back months after the patient's death and ask for permission to then archive and share that data. What makes this collection particularly interesting, I think, is that it's considered sensitive data. So if you could just click and bring up the definition, thank you. I think we have a tendency to often describe data as sensitive because it can touch on quite difficult topics. But it's important to remember that when we say sensitive data, that actually means something very specific under GDPR legislation. So that's the General Data Protection Regulation that the UK has adopted. When it does fit the definition of sensitive data, and you can see the definition here, then additional considerations need to be made for that particular data. And consent is always important, but when you've got sensitive personal data like this, then it's really, really important to make sure that you have your participants' consent to be working with that data and using it in the way that you've described. All right. Over to Anka, I believe now, to talk about quantitative.
Thank you, Maureen. Sorry. Okay, so now we're going to look into the steps that we need to take, right? So in terms of doing anonymization or pseudonymization on a specific data set, what are the steps we need to take? So this is similar for both quantitative and qualitative. And the first step is always to identify and remove or redact identifying information. So those are the direct identifiers that we spoke about. So we need to identify exactly what is it in that data set that can point directly to one person or to one unit of analysis, and then making a plan on to, of course, keeping in mind everything that we've discussed so far. So who is that data going to be shared with, if it's going to be shared, for how long, etc., access restrictions, everything. And then we go ahead and redact that information. So this is arguably easier for quantitative data because we just, we remove a row of data. Sorry, not a row, a column of data. However, it can vary for qualitative data, and I think that has been made clear by Maureen now. That there are different things that we need to keep in mind there for qual data. So options would be to replace them with a pseudonym. Or not redact out. So depending on what consent we have, who are we planning to share the data with, etc., what access controls would be applied. Okay, so that is step one. So step one is direct identifiers. Moving on to step two. So we have identifying, of course, indirect identifiers, and that is as we discussed already, all that sort of information that is not necessarily pointing to an individual, but can help, in a combination, help identify someone. And we have here a few examples. So we have the age, the date of birth, gender, occupation, income, geography, ethnicity, religion, and of course, these are just a few examples, and we have to keep in mind that they're different versions, right? So there's different ways in which you can have an age of date of birth, right? You don't have to have the date, exactly the date. You can have the month and the year, or you can just have the year. So there are different versions there. You can have that banded into age groups. Or you can have the year or the exact age, right? Occupation as well, there's different levels. Income, there's different levels that we can report that. We can put that in bands, or we can report the exact income. Geography, we can have that aggregated, or we can have it more localized. So they're different levels, I would call them, to these indirect identifiers. And when we talk about anonymization or pseudonymization, we can think about how much detail, and of course the smaller the level, the more precise the level, the more information there'll be in there. So when we're thinking about anonymization and pseudonymization, is really identifying, how much of that detail we want to keep in the data. So once we've identified all these indirect identifiers, then again, we have to keep in mind who are we sharing the data with? Are we putting the data under certain access restrictions? If you're planning on putting this data into an archive, for example, it might be worth, or we would recommend contacting them, because they can advise you on, depending on their access levels, they will advise on the amount of detail that can be kept in. Right, so Maureen discussed the different access levels that we have at UKDS. So for each of the access levels, so for safeguarded, for controlled, there is, so the stricter the access level, the more information, right? So the more detail we can keep in. So that is something we need to keep in mind when we think about redacting or doing any sort of transformation to the data. And then we have a third step after identifying those indirect identifiers. We need to check frequencies, so to identify potentially disclosive information. So here we're talking about small counts. So if we have in certain categories for certain variables, we only have a couple of people, and we also have a low geography, then that is something we need to look into. We need to check whether we have any outliers. So outliers would be observations that are quite far from the mean of that. So I'll give an example, age. So if we have someone who is 120 years old, then that will be an outlier because, of course, it's, I think there are not that many people out there that are 120. Hopefully we can reach it, but yeah, I think you get the example there. And then also then we have to check any string variables. So that would be any open text, so any variables, any questions that we had as open text or other, just to make sure that there is no personal, potentially disclosive or sensitive information there. So, and we put here some examples. So if someone were to say, I work for, and they're naming a company for 30 years, or if my brother has a rare type of disease, or I was in terms of sensitive information, I was a victim of domestic abuse, and I use a certain charity for support. So all this we need to, we need to read through every single one of these of these observations for string variables, and identify if there's anything in there that we need to redact out. Okay, so now in terms of anonymization techniques, so once we looked at, we've done the previous 3 steps, and we've identified perhaps any issues with the data. So what we're going to do in terms of preparing it or anonymizing it or pseudonymizing it before we can share it. So techniques here again, and make sure that you check with the archive if you're planning on archiving this, if you're planning on archiving data, because they would be able to advise better, and perhaps they would also be able to do this as well. But in terms of techniques, so we can aggregate or reduce the precision. So here, when we looked at the geography, if we have geographic information, perhaps it would be worth aggregating from a town to a city, sorry, not a town to a city, a town to a county, or anything that would give us, a larger population to pick from, and reducing the precision, right? So the smaller the geographic information, the higher the precision. Reduce categorical variables, or that would be indirect identifiers, into fewer categories. So if we think back at that profession variable, right, or that job role, so that can potentially be quite problematic. It can even be a direct identifier if that job role is very specific to a person. We actually did have, I remember I had a colleague at some point who, typed his job role into Google, and it was the only person who with that exact job role in the country. So that would be a direct identifier in that scenario. But there is that potential of aggregating or recoding those categorical variables into fewer categories, into larger categories, to reduce that precision. Then we have suppressing specific values for some units. So if we have some very low counts, as we discussed in the previous slide, it might be worth suppressing some of those values into a bigger category, for example, to make that less disclosive, generalizing the meaning of text variables, so reducing, when we talked about that free text response, it might be that we have to, make some reduction there if there's anything potentially identifiable or sensitive. Another technique would be to restrict the upper and lower ranges of a variable. So here, for example, would be income. If we have an outlier in the data that, has a very high income, then that can potentially be very disclosive. So we would top code that to a certain. So of course we need to look at the whole data set to gauge, to all the observations to gauge, where the mean is, etc., median, and then sort of decide that. Age is another example, so we might want to top code that at 70 plus, or we can also bottom code that if we have some young people if we have only one 18-year-old, for example, in a small town who has, let's say, a very rare type of disease, then that can be very disclosive. So in that situation, it's a combination of variables, right? So we have someone who's 16, someone who has a very rare type of disease. So we also need to take that into account. If you're more interested in this, it's called k-anonymity, and in terms of SDC, and I'll let you look more into that if you're interested, but that's beyond the scope of this webinar. And so again, how to decide? So we need to look at frequencies. So, if we have, as we discussed, if we have only 2 people or 3 people or 5 above the, if we have any outliers in the data, we might want to cap that into, 70 plus in terms of age, right? So we just need to look at frequencies here and decide whether there's anything that we need to redact. And then anonymizing georeference data, so replacing point coordinates with non-disclosive variables. So here, of course, if we have latitude and longitude in a data set, we need to first identify what that latitude and longitude refers to. So I remember we had a data set where they were collecting, the researchers were interested in collecting the location where people were eating, right? So they would collect wherever they would make an entry on their mobile phone, they would collect that latitude and longitude. So that arguably is not disclosive unless they were eating at their own house, right? So if at any point they were having their lunch at home and they were, putting an entry into the app that were collecting the data, then that is potentially disclosive. If they were walking around London having a snack out, that is not. So that we need to think very carefully about, what the data means and what it's pointing us to. Okay. Right, and now we have an example. So in terms of the anonymization techniques that we discussed above, so we have here a mock. This is not real data of just 4 different variables. So we have age, gender, profession, and ethnicity. If we look here at potential anything that we might, that might stand out, we have an 118-year-old female that can potentially be an outlier in the data, depending, of course, on the sample, but it's most likely that it will be an outlier. So, and also we have quite detailed information about the ethnicity. So we don't just have, white, black, Asian. We also have more information. So we have Caribbean, Irish, Pakistani, Scottish. So a way to, when we're thinking about ways to reduce the detail in a data set, that would look like, that would have these indirect identifiers. What would we do? So as we discussed, we would top code 80 plus to hide potential outliers and recode into fewer categories here. So we lost that amount, that additional information, and we recorded into a bigger category. So we have less precision. So this is just an example. Of course, you might have more indirect identifiers. So you need to think about all the different combinations as well, as we discussed. But this is one example. And now we have an exercise. Well, we have the same Menti exercise if we want to go back. However, Maureen, not sure if we would like to. Yeah.
Yeah, I was just thinking, do you think maybe we should just touch on a few of these questions first and then go back to Menti? Because
Sure.
we've had some really good questions coming through. I've tried to answer some of them as we go along, but it's probably useful just to reiterate some of those verbally. And then there's a few of them I haven't answered yet, just because they are really big questions. So I think it's probably good if Anka and I both kind of weigh in.
And also, if we don't, I'm just aware of time. So if we don't have time to answer, I think we can pick up a few questions, but we also want to go through the exercise because we wanted this to be an interactive workshop.
Yeah.
So we're going to try and answer a few questions, but for those that we can't, if we haven't answered your question, there's some contact information at the end of the slides. Please email us and we will be back in touch with an answer to your question. Okay. Yeah.
Yeah, I'll start with we'll just do a few of these open questions still, and then we can go back to look at some of the answered ones as well. So someone has asked, I've found a theoretical risk of re-identification has created very risk-averse reactions from legal teams negotiating data sharing and processing agreements, sometimes resulting in no agreement being reached. Do you have any tips for dealing with such situations? I don't know if I have tips per se. But of course, you know, we've had our own legal consultations where we've tried to negotiate, you know, what our end user license says, what some of the copyright statements we have say, what some of the specific terms are for our access conditions and that sort of thing. And we've all, you know, I often feel like if you get together, you know, 3 different lawyers, they'll have 3 very, very different views. And I'm sure some of you have also been in situations, even with ethical review boards, who sit there and debate about disclosure risk and potentially end up rejecting a proposal because they don't feel you've addressed every single potential disclosure risk and so on and so forth. So beyond just some of the legal, there's probably also ethical debates around some of this. I would say in all of these situations that it's really important to remember that complete anonymization is not actually possible. And if you have kind of clearly mapped out, this is where Mark Elliott's decision-making framework for anonymization is really helpful. I think if you've kind of mapped out different situations that you know the data will end up being in, that's probably a really useful starting point for some of those discussions as well, because you can kind of say, well, in this situation, this is what could happen, and this is how we will react to it. You know, and above all, if you have consent for your participants and you've clearly outlined to your participants where you may be using direct quotations or anecdotes, or where you will be publishing any of that raw data, you know, if you have consent in place, you've covered a huge range of issues in terms of legal responsibilities. So having that consent, having a really good participant information sheet and consent form is also really important here. If you have consent from your participants and they realize what you know, where there may be some risk of disclosure, then it's a moot point anyways, because you have consent. So I don't know if that is helpful, and hopefully that just gives you somewhere to take that. We have just another couple of questions and we'll go over to Menti. So someone has asked about anonymization processes with Indigenous communities that have different ethical frames than the EU-UK legal requirements, which I think is a really important question. So as researchers, obviously, we have legal requirements to meet, but ethically, you may have to go, you know, beyond that as well. And I personally would say that you'd want to make sure that you are adhering to indigenous communities frameworks as well. And that can be really difficult if you are a you know, kind of a quote unquote outsider to that community. Knowing fully how to implement that can be difficult. So involving them in the conversation and having a research design that includes them. I mean, if you're working with Indigenous communities, you probably already do participant-led research anyways, but involving them in that conversation will be absolutely necessary. And I would say, you know, ensuring that ethically you are abiding by what they would see as important, you know, is vital as well as meeting your legal requirements. So where the communities you work with go beyond those legal requirements, you may also have ethical responsibilities. And finally, and this is where one, Anka, I may need you, if you've got any insider knowledge as well on this, is the UK data service or the researcher legally responsible for making sure data protection is followed? So what I would say is that either the UK data service or the researcher can kind of check and look into whether or not data protection is followed. So if you ask for information about, you know, how many downloads your data set has had, or if we're aware of any outputs, publications arising from it, you know, we can supply that information to you. And we also do periodic searches to try and see if we can find if anybody has published anything further from our data sets, because it allows us to show the impact of those data sets further. So we do that periodically as well. But yeah, if we do find that somebody has done something they shouldn't with the data, they have signed our end user license, so we can hold them legally responsible. And because that contract is with us, it's something that we would initiate, but that doesn't mean that the researcher then doesn't have to look for it. If they want to, they can, you know, continue to look for how their data has been reused. I don't know if you have anything to add to that, Anka, at all.
No, I think you made an excellent point that you know, we do have a license in place, and when users agree to using the data, they agree to all the terms and conditions in that license. And if you know, they are directly responsible legally for what they're doing from that point onward. Yeah.
Okay, so if we go over to Menti now, and we have a few questions there, and there's still some more things coming in. So we'll have a look at those and perhaps review some of the answered ones that I typed in after Menti. So I'll hand it back to you, Anka.
Thank you. 1 second, I'll just share my screen again. Okay, hopefully you can see my screen, and also we have 125 people logged in. So I think we're all here. You just kept your Mentimeter going, so that's good. So we're just going to move on to the next question now, and hopefully you should see that on your screen. Okay, so we have examples of direct identifiers, and this would be a word cloud. So because we already had the previous question, we're not going to spend so long on this because we've already looked at, but we wanted to put that question again after we had looked through all the slides, just in case there was anything else that you know, we had in there. But yeah, so I can see that everyone is, I see job title there, which please keep in mind for our next question. It might be a trick question. National insurance number. Yeah, I think we know now what direct identifiers are. So that's very good. I'm just going to move on to the next one. We have indirect identifiers, and of course we discussed, we looked at indirect identifiers as well, and what they are, what to look for. Right, so we have age, we have religion, gender, job description, job category, postcode. Postcode can be potentially, it depends. It can also be a direct identifier, so depending on how many addresses are in that postcode. There are postcodes that only refer to one sort of residential area, so we need to be careful with postcodes. Also, postcodes would not be very easily to share either, just because in some cases they would point to 5 properties, so we need to be careful there with postcodes. But yeah, membership, designation, health conditions, job categories, yeah, that's all very good. Okay, we're gonna move on to the next question. Right, so now we're going to start a more competitive game where you will receive points depending on how quick you answer and of course if your answer is correct. Okay, so we have everyone joining here, that's good. So we need to answer fast to get the most points. So the first question is, which is most disclosive? And you need to take all that apply. So we have IP address, postcode, gender, and religious belief. And we have 20 seconds on the clock here. I see that 53 people, 54. Okay, the number is rising of people that have responded. Oh, okay. So let's see. IP address and postcode were the most common answers, and that's good. Yeah, so those were the correct answers as well. Very good if you've answered that. Okay, moving on to question 2. Is someone's job title personal information or a direct identifier? Yes, no, and I don't know. So the reason why both of them are correct, as you can see here, this was the trick, well, not a trick question, but so we discussed job titles earlier, and it depends on the job title. If the job title refers to, is very specific and only one or a couple of people in, I don't know, in the country, in the world have that job title, and I give the example of my colleague, then that is personal information because that would take us to that person. So it can be, but it's not. It depends on the situation, right? So we need to think about the context there. Okay, let's move on to the next question. What are direct identifiers? Tick all that apply. I was trying to, okay, so we have the results. So we have job title, email address, and national insurance number. Yeah, that is correct. Well done for those who answered that. So age, party affiliation, and health diagnostics would be what we refer to as indirect identifiers. They don't point us to an individual, but they are they can be quite disclosive if put together, potentially. Okay, question 4. What are indirect or not personal identifiers? Tick all that apply. Geographic coordinates, date of birth, gender, supermarket preference, sexual preference, ethnic background. Okay, I think we still have 3 people who have not responded yet.
Sorry, it seems some of them can only tick one option as opposed to all.
Oh,
that apply. Apologies. That's our settings. Sorry, guys.
Oh, I wasn't aware that was, okay, we'll need to look at that. Okay, so we have gender, date of birth, sexual preference, and ethnic background as the correct answers. Probably you were only able to select one. Yeah, we need to look at that, but you'll still get points if you got a correct one. Okay. We have, I think, 4 questions left. True or false? Anonymizing direct identifiers is enough to consider the data anonymized. False, yes, and that is very good. Yeah, indeed. So removing only the direct identifying information, it's not enough to consider the data anonymized. At that point, it will be classified as de-identified, and we'd have to go even further to look at indirect identifiers and so on, and what else can we do to reduce that precision of identification. Maureen, I'll let you look at this if you. I think these are the questions on
Yep, sorry, I was
Yeah,
just
no
trying to
worries.
whittle away at some of those question and answers. So some of you who post questions might have a written answer. All right, true or false? Data collected on a sensitive topic is always sensitive data. And excellent, yeah. So this is false. So it may be that there is data collected where the topic is sensitive, but it might not actually fit into what the GDPR classes as sensitive data, sensitive personal data. So if it's sensitive data, it would fall. I had that slide that had those specific definition written out, but there was a little bit of a laundry list in terms of what content the data would have that would make it sensitive. And it's possible that something may feel sensitive or may be on a sensitive topic that actually doesn't fit that definition per se. Okay, so when we talk about sensitive data, which requires further consideration of anonymization and consent in that, it may be that actually some data doesn't fit that definition, but it's still sensitive. Okay, moving on, next one. All right, another true false. It's good practice to annotate anonymization in qualitative research. So for example, with square brackets or anonymization log. So, and we actually just had someone ask about anonymization log as well in the chat. So is it good practice to annotate your anonymization? And yes, yeah, so most of you have gotten that, yeah. So if you, whatever your anonymization plan is, if you actually indicate what changes were made, whether through that is annotations or if it's through a log, that is good practice. And someone's just asked as well about that. How do you create one and how do you store it? And your storage of your anonymization log, because it would contain a column with the original wording and the page number and the file name, you'd want to make sure that that is something that is highly restricted so people don't just have access to it. Only necessary people from the research team and so on would have access to that. So you'd want to store it somewhere, perhaps even password protect the file. But you'd normally have something where you'd have the original text, what it changed to, and where to find it in your data set. So the file name and the page number it falls on. Okay, next. Which of the following strategies can be used to help protect participants' identities? So we'll see if that is a tick all that apply, if we got the setting right on that one or not. And we've got three options here: gaining informed consent, controlling access to the data, or anonymizing data as soon as possible. Just one for you, of course. Okay, so we've clearly screwed that one up. So let's see. Well, which option did you guys go for first? Oh, excellent. You're all thinking control. Well, not all, but a lot of you are thinking controlling access to the data. Hopefully, yeah, I mean, all of these can apply. So all of you are in essence correct. Interesting to see that the majority of you went to controlling access to the data. And certainly when we're thinking about qualitative data, controlling access is a very good strategy. The others are necessary as well. But yeah, controlling access is really important with qualitative data because of the nature of qualitative data. Okay, next question. What would be the first thing you do to anonymize data? Assess the data, who is going to reuse it, identify your role, perhaps as the data owner or a contributor, consider access control options, identify direct identifiers, or map the data, identify what is personal data and not. Okay, so yeah, you want to make sure you're doing some kind of assessment of the data, and this is sort of linked, I think, to the decision-making framework that is laid out by Mark Elliott. So you want to assess the data, consider what is your role in with that data, and then map out, identify, is it personal data, is it sensitive data, is it a direct or indirect identifier? Okay, excellent. Okay, and is the next one the leaderboard? Yeah. I know you're all very competitive, so you're oh, who's got Bodie McBoatface? That's fantastic. That's taken us back. All right, excellent. Rebecca with the goats. You have won the prize, which I think is really just you know, the knowledge that you are ready to go with anonymizing your data. So we've had, how many minutes do we have? We have a few minutes still just to have a look at some of the questions that have come up. Somebody has asked about social media data. So if you're working with like tweets, for example, and this is still something that I think archives specifically are working with because the challenge of social media and creating data sets from social media posts is that the users can change it. So if you tweet something, you can choose later to delete it or to retweet it with an edit, so on and so forth. You can redact who can see it and change it to a private account, that sort of thing. So it's, in a sense, it's live. And if you take the content of those tweets, there are all sorts of ethical issues with then preserving that in a data set, even though the user would, in a sense, like withdraw their consent of it being public. So what we tend to do is request that you use the tweet IDs instead. So the tweet IDs can be traced back to a specific person. So, you know, you wouldn't have to then anonymize that kind of linkage, if you will. It's up to the individual whether or not their Twitter is still public or not. So the tweet ID would bring you to the tweet, but the tweet ID itself doesn't have a code that allows you to identify who the individual is. It just brings you to the tweet, and if somebody's redacted it, then you just can't see it anymore. So those tweet IDs are really useful. All right, and Anka, did you want to answer
Yes.
the one about the images?
Oh, sorry, I was thinking, should we finish with the slides? We still have a few more slides, and then we can look at all the any questions at the end.
Yeah.
So we had just a slide with some useful software. So in terms of anonymizing or pseudonymizing quantitative data, and we included here some examples for you. So we probably STC Micro, this is in our package, and it's free. It has a very friendly user interface, so you don't need that coding skills, much in terms of coding skills. Then we also developed our own sort of easy to use tool. It is also open source. It's called QA My Data, and I included the links here for you to have a look. And of course, we're sharing the slides and ARX as well and UArgus. So you know, you can have a look and decide which one you prefer to use. Okay, so now talking about anonymization plans in practice. Maureen, did you want to still discuss the example we had, or?
Yeah, can you share the screen of it really quick? It'll just take me a moment. So some of you might be familiar with anonymization plans. You might have had to write one for a research project that you've done. We just wanted to share an example of one. This is from my PhD work. So this was done at the start of the project. And basically, when you put together an anonymization plan, you want to think about what are the different types of identifiers. So what are direct identifiers that might be in the data? What are indirect identifiers? So for this one, you've got a bit of a background to the project, and you've got a note about how some of those files are managed. So that might include information about who can access them, who can change them, where some of those things are stored. From there, I've divided it into things that are mandatory anonymization versus things that are potential anonymization. So here, direct identifiers, it says that I'll be using pseudonyms, and things like phone numbers, addresses, and that are going to be removed and replaced. And you can see what some of those replacements are. places that are mentioned, like a town name. You know, there's consideration of if it's a small town and there's a high risk of disclosure because the population is so limited, that sort of thing. Again, ages and dates. So these are, I think, the usual suspects, and these, I think, are all the ones that you guys kind of identified. But I also listed some things that are possible for anonymization, and that's medical and sensitive material. So these were things that I think would have come up quite easily in my interviews. You may also want to consider, for example, legal information. So if somebody's talking about court cases, if that's likely to come up in your interviews, it may be that some of those court case details are not allowed to be shared further. It's just what you think would be applicable to your particular research project. Mine was on pregnancy, so medical, of course, is probably going to come up. There may have also been things that I thought were sensitive, so people talking about their childhoods, for example. Or unfavorable opinions of their in-laws or that sort of thing. I thought, you know, there's a high risk there. So you might need to be careful about some of those. And it may be that in those cases, I would have edited those a little bit further, still using as light touch as possible, but just something that I might discuss with somebody else as to what my approach is with that. Yeah. Do we have any further slides? I think we just had a point about some of our upcoming webinars, just in case anyone was interested in those. And I think we might still have a minute or two. We might go over time a little bit, but there's a few more questions still. Yeah, so hopefully the key takeaway point from this is that your approach to protecting participants is really a three-prong approach where you're using access, control, anonymization, and consent. So it's not enough just to think about anonymization as I'm just going to pull out all of that sensitive material. You really need to think about, well, actually, that depletes the value of the data. I should also be thinking about regulating access and making sure my participants are agreeing to what I'm doing here. And if you enable all of those strategies, they make for a much more comprehensive anonymization plan. And we do have some tools and templates that are available online. So if you want to see a transcription template, transcription instructions, examples of confidentiality agreements, we have those sorts of things online. These slides will be posted online if you want to grab those specific URLs. We'll be posting those soon. And then, of course, there's even further resources outside of what we have. So some of the other archives have their own guidelines. The ICO also has some anonymization guidelines, and they've also put out a call on some upcoming chapters for consultation on those. So they're going to be publishing even more guidance. So again, we'll have those slides up if you want to use those links. And if you want to get in touch with us, we're all over social media. We're on Just Mail. We're on Facebook, YouTube, Twitter. So please follow us. And if you're interested in coming to any of our other events, you know, you've come to the one today, but have a look at some of the other upcoming ones. There may be some more topics that you're interested in learning a bit more about. We do regularly have online workshops and conferences. So do check out our events page to see if there's anything else. All right, so we are over time, but there are, I know, another couple of questions. If we haven't gotten to your question and you can't stick around, please do email us. We'll be happy to answer those via email as well. Yeah. Anka, did you want to address the one about images? Because I think that might have come out of one of the Menti questions, but I'm not sure.
I'm sorry, is that in the chat or the Q&A? Sorry, I was sharing my screen so I couldn't see.
No,
Q&A,
that's all right.
sorry. Why are images not a direct identifier? Well, it depends what the image is of. So if it's an image of Oh, did this come out of the Mentimeter? Did we have a question
I'm
about
not sure. I'm not sure. I was a bit confused by this. Images are
So,
normally direct identifiers, aren't they? If they're of a
of
person's
course,
face,
if they depict people, of course they are. Yes, and then, but yeah, yes. So the question is, why are they not? They are. It depends just what they're depicting. Yeah. Sorry, I was a bit confused as to what I was thinking. Do we have that?
No, that's all right. Yeah, so if it's of a
Um,
person, if it's just of a random photograph,
yeah.
that's with no people, that's not. But
And there was only one remaining. Is it important to anonymize all data subjects? Not sure how to phrase this. My worry is that when using qualitative data, there may be a risk that someone can be identified if they remain anonymous when the other subjects aren't. Maureen?
you don't have to anonymize all data subjects. So I can kind of think of examples in my head that this might be referring to. So if you are, for example, there was a PhD student, for example, who was doing research with eminent Chinese academics. And so they had sort of grouped together, and they're well-known names in their field. So if you were familiar with their field, very easy to identify from their interview transcripts who is who. So if you are working where everybody is kind of in the same field and you start this process of elimination because others have shared their name and one person hasn't, I think this is where it's really important to do an assessment of the data, an assessment of the risk. Just because people give you permission to share their names doesn't mean you have to. So if you feel that poses a risk to others in the data set, there's no reason why you wouldn't be able to anonymize the whole data set. It's just an option that's there, and ensuring that your participants have given consent for this, at least then you know where they stand and what they want. But if you haven't talked about that with your participants, then it's very difficult to make some of those decisions, and you are making them entirely based on how you feel about the situation. So yeah, just if you feel that that is a situation that would come up, then go ahead and anonymize the whole data set. No reason why you can't do that. But yeah, that's a good question. I think that might be a very specific question, though. I'm not sure that that would often happen per se, but hopefully that answers it.
Okay, thank you. I think we should stop. We're over 5 minutes over.
Okay.
Again,
Yeah.
if you had any other questions, or so of course we're gonna share the slides, and you know, if you have any other questions when looking at the slides, or the recording will also be available on YouTube. Please email us, and we'll answer all the questions. Other than that, thank you very much for joining. We hope this was useful, and yeah, have a nice day. Have a nice rest of the day. Thank you, everyone.